My mother, Helen, sent me a message in the family group chat right as I was lying on a gurney being wheeled into the operating room with a ruptured spleen. Myra, you have always been a troublemaker and a burden. We already have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight. We cannot cancel. Handle it yourself. My father, Richard, just quietly dropped a thumbs-up emoji next to a photo of my sister wearing a $2,800 designer dress they had just bought with my car insurance payout. I watched the phone screen blur, my fingers gripping the edge of the bedsheet reeking of antiseptic until my fingertips turned white, my breathing broken and shallow beneath the cold oxygen mask. My parents had no idea that while they were schmoozing the upper class with their fake glamour, I had already transferred every record of 96 months of financial support, along with a copy of the $50,000 credit loan bearing my forged signature into Grandpa Thomas's secure safe. This story will probably be hard to believe for a lot of people, but if it touched some part of your memory, please take a moment to like and subscribe, so I know I am not alone. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it on the clock where you are? Now, let me take you back 8 years, to the day when all of this taking began in the name of family. I looked down at my hands in the hospital bed. They were shaking. The kind of shaking you cannot stop no matter how hard you press your palms together. And the fluorescent light above me was so white, it turned my skin into something I did not recognize. But the trembling was pulling me somewhere else, somewhere the light was not white but gold. Somewhere the air did not smell like iodine and latex but like cinnamon tea and old leather-bound books. Grandpa Thomas's office. The day the acceptance letter came. I ran my fingers along the edge of the envelope sitting on his oak desk, feeling the grain of the paper, tracing the raised print of my name with a slowness that made every letter matter. My arms stretched out under the afternoon sun cutting through his window, my knuckles loosening for the first time in weeks. I picked up the small silver spoon, stirred the ceramic cup of tea he had already poured, and listened to the clear ringing sound it made in the silence of that room, my eyes following the spirals of steam rising from the surface. Grandpa sat across from me and pushed a small wooden box toward my side of the desk. I lifted the lid, the brass hinge creaking faintly, and inside was a stethoscope, my first one. I picked it up and felt the cold of the metal sink into my palm, then slowly wound the tubing around my wrist like a promise I was making to myself. I looked at his old hands resting one on top of the other, the wrinkles still and deep like marks carved into wood, and they gave me something I did not have a word for yet. Something solid, something that held. That warmth did not last. Richard stood up from the armchair in the living room, not looking at my face, but leaning down to tap his fingernail against the stack of mortgage bills sitting in the center of the dining table. The tapping was dry and steady, like a clock counting backward, each strike making the thin paper shiver. A doctor is really just a practical body mechanic, Myra. Do not look at that degree and think you are something special. You will never have the God-given soul Vanessa has. He picked up the check I had just signed, glanced at the number, $2,400, with an expression that could have been boredom, and slipped it into his shirt pocket where the top button was fastened wrong. He patted the pocket once, the way a man pats his wallet after settling a tab. Helen stood beside him, and she did not stop brushing Vanessa's hair. Her fingers threaded through the blonde strands, the plastic teeth of the comb sliding through each section with a gentleness she reserved for one daughter. I tried to tell her about the cardiac surgery I had completed that morning, the one that had taken 11 hours, but she did not turn around. She smoothed a curl behind Vanessa's ear and smiled at her own reflection in the mirror, the kind of smile that is meant to be seen by everyone except the person standing behind her. I sat down at the table and locked my hands together under it, my fingertips digging into the centers of my palms to keep the rest of my body from giving anything away. I breathed in slowly, my chest rising under the white shirt I had not changed out of since my shift, and fixed my eyes on a small scratch in the wooden tabletop that I had filled in myself the summer before with wood filler and a putty knife I bought at the hardware store on my way home from a 14-hour rotation. Nobody had noticed the repair. Nobody had noticed the scratch. I reached into my coat pocket and touched the stethoscope, the cold of the bell pressing against my skin like a point of reference I could hold onto when everything else was noise. I stood up and walked to the family medicine shelf in the corner of the kitchen. I began rearranging the small glass bottles by height, listening to the dry knock of glass meeting wood at regular intervals. My finger traced the thin layer of dust on a cap, my eyes measuring the millimeters between each bottle, adjusting them with a precision that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with needing one small thing in this house to be in order, while the pressure in my throat kept climbing. My shoulders dropped half an inch. My jaw unclenched. The bottles stood in a perfect row, and for 3 seconds the world was something I could manage. I kept thinking about something I could not have put into words until that exact moment. In this house, my voice shrank in direct proportion to the money I put into it. Every bill I paid was not a brick building their gratitude. It was a nail pinning me deeper into the role of the provider who was not allowed to feel. The only reason I had stayed in this suffocating house as long as I did was to save every penny for Lily and Lucas, keeping them tucked away in the safety of Grandpa Thomas's guest wing most weekends so they wouldn't have to breathe the same toxic air my parents exhaled. They needed my money to feed Vanessa's dream of becoming an artist, but they needed my silence even more, because without it, they could not keep believing they were still the ones in charge. That silence turned into an unwritten rule at dinner that night when my mother placed the thickest cut of meat into Vanessa's bowl, and my father slid another insurance bill across the table to me without lifting his eyes from the newspaper. They did not know that every tap of Richard's fingernail against that table was pushing me closer to the moment when the thing they called a family would be laid open for exactly what it was, and that moment was already waiting for me in the next room. 3 days later, the family gathered for dinner to celebrate a small gallery showing of Vanessa's work. I came through the front door after a 36-hour shift. My eyes so red the blood vessels had turned the whites into a map I could have read with my own training. Nobody asked me to sit down. The sink was full of dishes crusted with grease, and the smell of roasted meat hung in the air like a reward I was not yet permitted to reach, until every plate was clean and every glass was spotless for the star of the evening. I bent over the sink, both arms buried in white soap foam, and picked up a porcelain plate. I pressed the sponge hard into the dried fat, the sound of ceramic scraping against the stainless steel basin cutting through the room. Cold water ran over my wrists, and I kept my back straight, even though the pain from my lower spine had started to spread. My eyes locked on the swirl of water pulling the remains of their meal down the drain. I dried each glass with a cloth towel, lifting it toward the overhead light to check for streaks with the same attention I gave to suture lines in the operating room. Behind me, Vanessa sat on the high stool by the kitchen counter, her legs swinging back and forth, one hand scrolling through the newest phone, the other pushing a strand of hair off her forehead, before she stretched with a slow, careless yawn that showed off a fresh set of manicured nails. She picked up her glass of wine, took a small sip, and left a bright red lipstick print on the rim without once looking at the sound of the water or the curved back of her sister 3 feet away. "Myra, hurry it up. Vanessa needs these ribs to recover after her painting session. You have been at the hospital all day, so you probably will not even taste the food. Stop standing there looking lost." Helen spooned the largest, most tender rib onto a gold-rimmed bowl reserved for Vanessa. She drizzled the thick red sauce over the white rice in careful spirals, then wiped a tiny drop from the edge of the bowl with a napkin, as though she were handling porcelain at an auction. She turned to my side of the table and placed the empty serving spoon onto my bare plate sitting in the corner, her hand pulling back quickly to adjust the collar of Vanessa's blouse. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the cash I had handed him that morning. He peeled off several $100 bills under the table and pushed them toward Vanessa without looking up. His eyes passed over me the way they pass over a lamp or a doorframe, something in the room that had always been there and required no acknowledgement. He picked up his newspaper, turned the page with a decisive snap that covered the sound of the breath I held behind my teeth, then tapped his fork against the edge of his bowl, signaling me to bring more water. He did not raise his head once to see the face of the daughter who had been awake for a day and a half, keeping strangers alive. I held my own glass of water, leaning my back against the edge of the sink, and drank in small sips to ease the dry scraping in my throat. My eyes were fixed on a hairline crack in the kitchen tile, my index finger tracing its path without thinking, feeling the rough edge of old grout under my skin. I did not sit down at the table. I stood there and watched the three of them talk and laugh, my body upright and still, only my chest moving in quick, shallow beats that I kept as quiet as I could. There was a place set for me at the corner, the plate still empty, the napkin still folded, and not one of them had looked at it since I walked through the door. I peeled off the yellow rubber gloves and laid them flat on the counter, smoothing each finger of the glove with a mechanical precision that had become second nature. I looked down at my own hands, the red welts from hot water and soap sharp against my pale skin, and I clenched them into fists, then released, clenched and released, 3 times. I bent to pick up a crumpled napkin from the floor, folded it into fourths, and dropped it into the trash. My lips pressed together in a line so tight there was no space left between them. These were the hands that had held a beating heart steady inside a man's open chest that morning. In this kitchen, they held sponges. I kept thinking that I was standing in the middle of a kitchen that my money had paid for, tile by tile, and I had become something that exists without being seen. They did not dislike me. They simply did not register me as a person who had thoughts or preferences or a body that could get tired. To my parents, I was an economic unit, a life support system for Vanessa's idea of herself as an artist. The invisibility was not just the absence of attention, it was a quiet kind of humiliation that wore down my sense of self faster than any spoken cruelty could have. When Richard stood up and walked toward me with a new loan application in his hand, I understood that my invisibility was about to be replaced by something more direct. The kind words wrapped around obligation and the pressure built from years of family duty were already waiting in the narrow hallway where I would have no room left to step aside. Dinner ended in a silence that felt like the air before a storm, and Vanessa disappeared upstairs with the fresh stack of bills. Richard did not let me leave. He stepped into the hallway between me and the front door, planted his feet wide, and crossed his arms high on his chest so his shoulders rose into a wall I could not pass. He did not speak right away. He just stood there staring at a point on my forehead, his breathing coming out in thick, steady wheezes in the closed space. His index finger tapped a rhythm against his own bicep, the dull sound of skin on skin filling the corridor, where the only photographs on the wall were of Vanessa and the two of them, a portrait from Vanessa's first recital, a snapshot from a vacation I had not been invited to, a family Christmas card I had paid for but was not pictured in. Not a single frame held my face. The hallway light above us flickered on and off, casting Richard's shadow long and then short across my body, and the air smelled like the lavender plug-in Helen kept near the front door, a scent that did not belong in a space that felt like it was closing in. I stopped walking, my shoulders pulled inward, my back pressing flat against the cold plaster of the hallway wall. I looked down at the floor and watched a single dust particle rolling near the toe of my shoe, my hands hanging at my sides, but my fingers gripping the fabric of my pants so hard the knuckles ached. I did not move. My body held still like stone while I tracked his old leather shoes inching toward me 1 centimeter at a time, the space around me tightening until there was only enough room left for one short breath. Your mother and I gave up everything, stayed up through the night so you could wear that white coat, Myra. Now you are going to stand there and watch your sister lose her apartment over a few numbers in a bank account? Do not be selfish. This is when your family needs you most. He stepped forward and pushed a credit loan application for $50,000 close enough to my face that I could read the interest rate printed in bold at the top. His thumb pressed down on the line that read, "Guarantor," his nail leaving a crease in the white paper. His other hand closed around my shoulder, a grip that carried no warmth, only the weight of control. And he bent low until his face was level with mine, his breath thick with cigarette smoke hitting my skin without permission. I did not look up. I reached out and took the paper from him, my fingers touching the cold, sharp edge. I ran my thumb along the corner, listening to the faint rustle of paper between us, my eyes moving quickly across the interest figures printed in black. I did not push his hand away. I let it sit heavy on my shoulder, my lips pressed together so hard they had gone white, and my pulse was beating fast enough to see in the fabric of my shirt collar a small rhythmic tremor just below my jaw. I closed my eyes for 1 second and tried to bring back the image of Grandpa Thomas sitting in his old study with that quiet smile. I inhaled deeply through my nose, felt the cool air spread inside my chest, then let it out through my mouth so softly it made no sound at all. I focused on the sensation of my feet pressing against the floor, the firmness of the ground beneath the worn hallway carpet. And when I opened my eyes, I looked past Richard's shoulder to a point of light at the far window. The glass was streaked with condensation from the temperature difference between the heated house and the cold night outside, and I counted 3 droplets moving slowly down the pane, following their paths until my pulse came down to a rate I could manage. I let the loan paper rest in my open hand, my fingers drifting over the framed photographs of Vanessa on the wall with no resentment, only observation. I raised my hand to straighten my shirt collar, the movement slow and exact, smoothed a small wrinkle in the fabric, then flicked a strand of hair off my shoulder. Every motion I made was calculated to produce nothing Richard could grab onto and use, and I became something flat and still and impossible to reach. In that moment, I saw the entire pattern my father had been running for 40 years. Their love for me did not have a pulse. It was a series of debt clauses wrapped in the language of sacrifice. They were not asking for my help. They were collecting on an investment they believed I had not yet paid back in full. The part that cut deepest was not that they wanted money. It was that they believed I did not deserve a life of my own unless that life served theirs. I folded the loan paper into quarters with one sharp crease, the sound of paper breaking clean in the still hallway. I did not answer Richard. I stepped around him and walked toward the door where the dark of the evening was waiting. I did not know yet that a few hours later, a collision on a rain-soaked highway would send me to the bottom, where the full measure of their indifference would be delivered in a single text message that I would read from a hospital gurney. The crash on that rain-soaked highway was a blur of headlights and screaming metal, a violent end to an 18-hour day. When I woke up under the white ceiling of the emergency room, the physical pain in my side was nothing compared to the silence on the other end of the phone. I had reached for them, the people who shared my blood, with a hand still smeared with road dust and dried blood. I lay flat on the metal gurney, my right arm gripped the steel rail until my knuckles turned white, watching the saline drip down the IV line as the ringing tones stretched on and on. I didn't need a doctor to tell me I was broken. I was waiting for a reason to keep breathing. The message appeared on the screen, and the blue light hit my face in that particular way hospital rooms have of making everything look worse than it already is. My thumb froze over the reply button, then slowly dropped onto the wrinkled sheet. My chest tightened, not from the surgery, but from a pressure that stopped my breath somewhere between my throat and the place where words form. I lowered the phone and let it fall onto the linoleum floor, the small sound swallowed by the suction machine running in the next room. Helen had written it in the family group chat for everyone to see. Myra, you have always been a troublemaker and a burden. We already have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight. We cannot cancel. Handle it yourself. My shoulders dropped, my knees drew up to my chest, and my arms wrapped around my own body, fingers digging into the gray hospital fabric, crushing it in palms that were slick with cold sweat. Tears ran sideways across my temples and soaked into the white gauze on my head, but no sound came out. I lay there, my body trembling in small waves, my eyes staring into a space that had no edges and no end. After a long stillness, I raised my hand and wiped what was left on my cheeks with the rough back of my knuckles in one decisive motion. My face stopped moving. My lips sealed into a straight line and stayed there. I let go of the bed rail, opened my palm, and looked at the deep red grooves the steel had pressed into my skin. Something in my eyes changed, shifting from a look that was asking for help to a look that was not asking for anything at all, fixed on a single point on the opposite wall with a clarity that had no warmth in it. I pushed myself upright with my right hand, ignoring the pain that tore across my hip, and set my feet on the cold floor with a steadiness that did not match what had just happened. I reached down and picked up the phone, swiped through the notifications, and cleared every trace of Helen's message without leaving a single unread badge behind. I smoothed the bedsheet, straightened the hem of the hospital gown with care, each movement slow and deliberate. My shoulders opened, my head lifted, and my breathing settled into something deep and even, a quiet that felt more final than the panic that had come before it. In that moment, I understood that the only thread still connecting me to them had snapped along with the rhythm of that text. They had treated my life as an inconvenience that got in the way of a concert, so I no longer had a reason to treat them as shelter. I was no longer the daughter begging for their attention. I was a woman who had started counting down the days until the truth came out. Before I tell you what I did next, if you have ever had to pick yourself up when every person who was supposed to hold you had already walked away, take a moment and press that like button so I know this is reaching someone. Have you ever had to face an unbearable truth about the people closest to you? Stay with me, because I am about to show you how I started taking back what was mine. I left the hospital ahead of schedule with a folder pressed flat under my jacket and a steadiness in my eyes that had not been there when the ambulance brought me in. My footsteps on the empty corridor made a different sound now, the sound of a woman walking out of a role she had played for 8 years. A piece of evidence locked inside Grandpa Thomas's safe was waiting for me, and it led to something far worse than being abandoned on an operating table. 2 weeks later, I walked back through my parents' front door wearing the face of a recovering daughter who had learned her lesson. Richard and Helen carried on as if the text message had never existed. They were busy showing off photos from the concert and complaining that my absence had caused the mortgage payment to arrive 5 days late. They did not know that every time they left the house, I moved through the rooms in silence, working the locked drawers in Richard's office, tracing the trail of my insurance money and a set of loan documents that carried my name in handwriting I had never used. I straightened a paperclip and eased it into the lock of the bottom drawer of his desk, listening for the faint click in the quiet room where the only light came through a gap in the closed blinds. My fingers moved fast through the yellowed folders, flipping past power of attorney forms until I stopped at a credit loan application for $50,000. I held the page up to the desk lamp, and my eyes opened wide when I saw the signature that was supposed to be mine, the hook on the Y too dramatic, the tail on the A looping in a direction my hand had never gone in my entire life. I slid my phone out, held both hands steady, and framed the page so every line of the forged name was in focus. I turned to the next sheet where the stated purpose of the loan read, "Support for Vanessa's art venture," and kept recording every figure, every disbursement date, every decimal point. When I was done, I placed everything back in the exact position it had been, set a single strand of my hair across the edge of the drawer as a tell, and stepped back. My breathing had not changed once, though my palms were wet enough to leave marks on the leather desktop. Grandpa Thomas pushed a black briefcase across the table toward me, the brass clasps popping open with a dry snap that filled his library. He used his thin, veined hand to pull out bank statements one by one, each page marked with red highlighter over the monthly mortgage transfer of $2,400. Myra, in 40 years on the bench, I saw every kind of person who builds a life on somebody else's labor. But using your own blood to underwrite vanity is something I will not stand for. This is the payment record, 96 months, that I put together for you. He placed his hand on my shoulder with a weight that felt like protection and looked straight into my eyes with the severity of a man who had spent his career deciding what was right and what was not. Then handed me a thick legal file that held everything I would need to turn the entire situation on its head. I took the folder and felt the weight of 96 silent months resting in my hands. I turned to the last page where he had attached my real signature next to the one Richard had forged on the $50,000 loan. I nodded once, said nothing, and gripped the edge of the briefcase until the leather creased under my fingers. I looked into the fire burning in the hearth, and the shape of something I had waited years for moved across my eyes before I put the file into my bag and prepared to walk back out wearing a new face over the old one. I returned to my parents' house just before dinner, hung my jacket on the hook as if nothing had changed, and went straight to the kitchen to help Helen make tea. I picked up the ceramic pot, poured boiling water into the cup without spilling a single drop onto the counter, and smiled faintly when Richard asked about my shift. My voice came out clear and warm, so convincing that he did not look at me twice, which meant he did not think about the legal file sitting under the seat cushion of my car. I bent down and picked up a breadcrumb from the kitchen floor, dropped it in the trash, and performed the small domestic tasks of someone who had been trained to serve. I sat at the dinner table, listened to Vanessa describe the designer dresses she planned to buy for the upcoming celebration, and nodded along at the right moments like a machine set to agree. My eyes moved across the faces of Richard and Helen, registering every detail of the satisfaction sitting on their features, while my hand under the table pressed silently into my palm to remind myself of what Grandpa's file contained. Sitting in the middle of that warm family dinner that meant nothing, I felt like an actor waiting for the curtain to come down on a show that had run for far too long. The confidence my parents carried now was the very thing that would make the fall steeper when the truth came out. They believed they had locked down my financial future with a forged signature, but they had no idea that Grandpa Thomas had handed me the means to take back everything they had taken. I was not just preparing to reclaim money. I was preparing to reclaim my name in front of every person in our family who had ever watched me shrink. Grandpa Thomas's celebration dinner was 3 days away, and it would be a stage my parents had never imagined standing on. I looked at the pen sitting on Richard's desk and wondered what their faces would look like when the truth did the work for me. The clock was almost at 0, and the pressure I had been holding was about to meet the moment they believed they were winning most completely. The night of Grandpa Thomas's celebration, the ballroom was lit by a chandelier that threw small rainbows across the linen tablecloths, and the classical music was the kind that makes people stand straighter and speak more softly. Richard and Helen had dressed in their finest, working the room with handshakes and stories about Vanessa's artistic promise, their voices carrying a warmth they saved exclusively for people who were not their older daughter. I stood near a column at the edge of the room and watched them perform the role of the devoted family, knowing that tonight was the night they had chosen to force my real signature onto the $50,000 loan and close the deal for good. Helen walked toward me with a wide smile, placed her diamond-ringed hand on my shoulder, and patted it with the tenderness of a mother who wanted to be seen being tender. She used a silver fork to set the most expensive piece of foie gras onto my plate, then leaned toward the aunts standing nearby and began telling them how hard I worked as a doctor, how proud she was, how the family could not function without me. She tilted her head and brushed a strand of hair from my forehead with a look of pure adoration, the kind of performance that made the relatives nod and murmur about what a beautiful bond a mother and daughter could have. I sat still, feeling the false warmth of her hand through my sleeve, my eyes tracking every curve of her lips as she delivered each sugar-coated word. I lifted my wine glass and took the smallest sip to cover what was rising in my chest, keeping a faint smile on my face to match the scene. Helen continued wiping an imaginary mark from my sleeve, a gesture so exaggerated in its care that it drew approving glances from everyone within reach. Richard pulled a blue folder from inside his jacket and slid it across the white tablecloth toward me in one clean motion. His index finger pressed hard on the line marked Guarantor, his nail tapping against the paper in a rhythm louder than the violins. "Sign it, sweetheart, just to help your sister this one time. This is Vanessa's last chance to save her fashion career. And on a doctor's salary, 50,000 is a small number to keep the family name where it belongs." He did not look at my face. He scanned the guests chatting nearby, keeping his expression professional and calm, as though the document between us were nothing more than a routine matter that needed a quick signature. I looked down at the figures printed under the chandelier light, my chest tightening with each tap of his finger. I reached forward and touched the cold edge of the folder, feeling the weight of the heavy paper stock waiting for my agreement. Richard did not shift his posture. He stood over me with a wine glass in his free hand, untouched, his eyes cutting across my face to measure every micro-expression, while Vanessa's laughter rang out from the next table. When I did not move, Helen leaned close to my ear and the mask dropped. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched, and her right hand found my wrist under the table. Her long nails pressed into my skin until I felt the sharp sting of each point breaking through, a warning delivered in silence. Her voice dropped into something low and thick, and she reminded me that I was living in a house she had spent her life maintaining, and that if I refused to sign, she would tell every relative in this room that I was the ungrateful daughter who had been stealing her parents' retirement. Richard bent down too, his breath heavy with wine hitting my face, both hands pressing onto the table hard enough to make the glasses tremble. The muscles in his neck stood out under his tightly knotted tie, his jaw pushed forward, his whole body holding back something that did not belong in a ballroom. I felt the pressure from both sides, a vice tightening around me in the middle of a room full of people who were still raising their glasses and laughing because they had no idea what was happening at our end of the table. I looked at the gold pen Richard had pushed toward me and understood that this was the moment they believed they had won. They had built the perfect setting, a room where I could not shout or resist without destroying my own reputation in front of everyone I had grown up with. But the quiet I was holding was not the quiet of someone who had given in. It was the quiet of a woman who was waiting for one specific second to arrive, the second when the truth would do every bit of talking I had spent 8 years keeping inside. My hand reached for the pen. I ran my thumb along the cool metal barrel while both of my parents' eyes flared with a certainty so complete it looked like hunger. I lifted the nib, held it exactly 1 millimeter above the signature line, and felt the entire table go still as the relatives closest to us began to turn their heads. But instead of lowering the pen onto the paper that would have signed away another piece of my life, I was waiting for Grandpa Thomas to stand, to tap his silver spoon against the rim of his glass, and to begin the only conversation my parents had never prepared for. The music in the ballroom seemed to pull back to a distant corner when my pen stopped moving above the signature line of the $50,000 loan. Richard and Helen were holding their breath, their eyes carrying a greed they could no longer hide behind the expensive clothes and the soft lighting. I lifted my head slowly, but I did not look at the paper. I looked straight at Grandpa Thomas standing at the head of the table. This was the second the clock hit 0, the second when 96 months of silence ended with a single action. My right arm lowered the pen to the polished wood surface, the sound of metal meeting oak ringing out dry and final in the hush. I used my left hand to pull Grandpa Thomas's black leather briefcase onto the table, my fingers moving slowly to release the 2 brass clasps, each one producing a clean, sharp click. I drew out a thick stack of documents and laid it directly on top of Richard's fraudulent loan application, then pressed my open palm across the white paper to flatten it, my eyes not leaving the columns of figures printed in heavy black ink beneath my hand. I stood up straight, shoulders squared, both hands resting firmly on the table, and not a single muscle in my face moved under the bright light. My eyes swept across the relatives gathered around us, registering every raised eyebrow and every shortened breath as they noticed the bank statements fanning out across the linen. I picked up the $50,000 loan bearing the signature that was supposed to be mine and held it up so the chandelier lit the page from behind, making the difference between Richard's unsteady hand and my actual signature, pinned neatly to the page behind it, visible to everyone within 10 feet. This is 96 months of mortgage payments I made for this house, and this is the $50,000 loan my parents took out under my name while I was unconscious in surgery for a ruptured spleen. Richard lunged forward, both hands slamming the table so hard the wine glasses toppled and red wine spread across the white cloth like a stain that could not be taken back. His face flushed dark, the veins in his neck standing out against his tight collar. A low, guttural sound pushing out of his throat as he grabbed for the documents in my hand. He swept his arm across the center of the table and sent the crystal vase crashing to the floor, the sound of shattering glass filling every corner of the room, his eyes wide and rolling with something that had no resemblance to the composed father he had been playing all evening. Helen shot to her feet, her lips shaking, her fingers clawing into the chair fabric until the red polish on her nails disappeared into the upholstery. She began shouting words I had been called in whispers for years, but never in front of an audience, calling me a scheming daughter who had plotted to humiliate her own parents at a family gathering. The guests around us stepped back at the same time, faces caught between shock and a growing recognition of what they were seeing, as Helen grabbed a porcelain plate and hurled it to the floor at my feet, shards scattering across the tile while she kept insisting that I was the one who had stolen Vanessa's future. Grandpa Thomas stepped forward. He lifted a silver spoon and struck the rim of his wine glass 3 times, a thin, clear sound that carried more authority than any voice in the room, and Richard and Helen froze mid-motion. He placed his large, steady hand on my shoulder and pulled me behind him, then turned to face my parents with the same expression he must have worn when handing down a sentence. He opened the transfer records wide and pointed to each line, reading aloud the total, $280,400 I had paid into this family over 8 years, while the room around him buzzed with murmurs that sounded nothing like sympathy for the 2 people standing across the shattered glass. I stood behind Grandpa, arms folded across my chest, and for the first time all evening my breathing was deep and steady in the middle of the chaos. I looked down at the shattered remains of the vase and the wine staining the tablecloth, and something that had been locked inside my ribs for a very long time began to loosen and move outward toward my fingertips. I bent down and picked up my pen from where it had rolled, capped it slowly, and slid it into my shirt pocket. My eyes did not look at Richard and Helen the way you look at people you are fighting. They looked at them the way you look at strangers standing on the other side of a window, people who can no longer reach the room you are standing in. The moment those numbers were spoken out loud under the light, I understood that the truth does its own work if you let it. They could no longer wrap the taking in the language of love, because every person in that room had now seen what was behind the concert tickets and the designer dress that had been paid for with my sweat. I had given myself back the only thing they could never put a price on, and I did it by laying everything on the table where it could not be unseen. Richard and Helen stood frozen among the shattered glass while the relatives began to pull away from them the way people move away from something they do not want to be associated with. Grandpa Thomas signaled his legal assistant to approach with a new set of papers, a clear sign that the forged signature and the misappropriated funds would not end with a family dinner. I walked out of the ballroom and left the sound of their voices behind me, heading toward the quiet of the evening where the shape of a different life was waiting to begin. 1 month after that dinner, the truth started doing its work without any help from me. The house I had carried for 8 years was placed into a settlement process that Grandpa Thomas initiated to recover the $50,000 forged loan and the years of misappropriated payments. Richard and Helen were facing a reality that had no cushion left under it, because the relatives who had once crowded around them at every gathering now returned their calls to voicemail or did not return them at all, and the mask of upper-class respectability they had built with my income was in pieces that no amount of charm could reassemble. Richard sat on the bare floor of the living room, his hands shaking as he held the bank's notice of foreclosure proceedings. He scraped his fingernails slowly across the rough surface of the paper, his eyes unfocused, staring at the balance figures I was no longer covering. He picked up his phone and started dialing numbers from the circle of well-connected friends who had once laughed at his jokes and accepted his generous tips. But one by one he lowered the phone back to his lap as the calls went unanswered or clicked straight into a recording. His shoulders dropped, his knees drew up, and his breathing came heavy and uneven in a room that now smelled only of cardboard boxes and dust. Helen stood by the window, her fingers turning the frayed edge of an expensive scarf that had seen better days, her eyes following the moving truck carrying Vanessa's belongings as it rolled slowly out of the front gate. She opened the vanity drawer, searching for her last bottles of department store moisturizer, but found only empty containers and a stack of overdue credit card statements piled on top of each other. She lowered herself into the only lazy boy recliner left in the room, ran her palm back and forth across the cracked leather seat, and pressed her lips shut without making a sound as she stared at the for sale sign planted in the center of the front yard. Vanessa came through the living room door with red-rimmed eyes and hair that had not seen a brush in days. She stood far from me, her hands clasped tight against her chest, and slowly lowered her head, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. She held out a stack of handwritten letters Helen had sent her over the years, letters that described me as the cold, calculating daughter who wanted to use money to control the entire family. Myra, I did not know they used your name to take out loans for projects that were supposed to be mine. They told me you agreed to support me because you were the successful one. I am sorry I believed everything they said. She stepped back, her eyes full of something that had not been there before as she looked at the long scar running down my forearm from the accident, and every trace of the entitlement she used to carry had disappeared. I didn't realize you were carrying all this weight just to keep the kids safe, she whispered, her eyes dropping to the floor. They told me you were just being selfish with your salary. I stood still, watching my sister with a level gaze, my hands deep in my jacket pockets to keep my body from producing any reaction she could read. I did not nod, and I did not wave her away. I watched her tear the concert photographs in half with her own fingers, the glossy pieces falling to the floor like the remains of something that had already died. She reached out as if to touch my shoulder, but pulled her hand back before it landed, her eyes dropping to the floor, her lips pressing together to hold in the sound that was trying to escape. I walked to the old wooden table and used a soft cloth to wipe the dust from the framed photograph of Grandpa Thomas and Grandmother, then wrapped it carefully in a sheet of packing foam. I did not glance toward the next room where Richard and Helen were sitting. My movements were slow and precise, focused entirely on protecting the only objects in this house that held real value. I placed both frames inside the small wooden box, closed the lid, and fastened the latch with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. I handed Vanessa a bottle of water and a slip of paper with the phone number of a job placement office, a gesture that was professional and distant, but carried nothing that resembled spite. I looked out the window at Lily and Lucas sitting in the back seat of my car, then turned away from the house, my steps firm on the gravel walkway. I did not stop to look back. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I felt the steady vibration of the engine and the cool air from the vent on my face, and the car moved forward. The truth did not only take back money, it peeled away every layer of the story they had been telling until each person was standing in the position they had earned. My parents lost the house they had never actually owned through their own labor, and I got back the kind of quiet that no dollar amount can purchase. I did not need to celebrate, because the collapse itself was the most complete verdict anyone could have written. I drove out of the old neighborhood and left the for sale sign swaying in the late afternoon wind behind me. Grandpa Thomas had closed the legal matters, and the only thing left for me to do was learn how to build a life for myself and my children without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on every decision. 12 months from now, my world would look nothing like this one, and the calls from the past would no longer have the power to change the rhythm of a single breath. 12 months had passed since I placed that stack of documents on the dinner table in front of my family. My life was no longer measured in overnight shifts taken to cover someone else's bills. It was measured in the sound of Lily and Lucas laughing in the sunlit apartment I had chosen for its south-facing windows, and the way the light moved across the floor in the late afternoon. The scar on my stomach had faded to a thin line I could trace with one finger, but the clarity in my mind had only gotten sharper. I had learned to take care of myself with the same respect I used to hand over to people who never planned to give it back. I sat in a linen armchair the color of cream, holding a notebook where I tracked the education fund I was building for my children, a pencil circling the savings total I had reached this quarter. My eyes followed a patch of sunlight sliding across the clean hardwood floor. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf, used a silk cloth to wipe a thin layer of dust from the stethoscope Grandpa had given me, and felt the cold of the metal move through my palm, a sensation that no longer carried any memory of being taken from, but only the steady knowledge that I had built this on my own. I stepped into the kitchen, my bare feet meeting the cool wood, without the stiffness that used to lock my body every time I stood in my parents' kitchen waiting to serve. I lifted the ceramic teapot, poured hot water into a cup, and listened to the quiet sound of liquid settling in a room where no one was going to criticize the temperature or tell me I was doing it wrong. I raised the cup to my lips, closed my eyes, and let the scent of chamomile fill the space behind my forehead, my chest rising in deep, full breaths, my shoulders low and loose for the first time in a story that had kept them near my ears for 8 years. The phone on the dining table buzzed and the screen lit up with the word "Mom" and a string of missed calls I recognized from an older chapter of my life. I stood still and watched the phone turn slowly on the wood surface, the ringtone cycling through its pattern without changing my heart rate by a single beat. I did not pick it up. I did not press decline or block the number. I just stood there and watched until the call ended on its own and the screen went dark, returning the silence to the room. I reached out and turned the phone face down on the table in one slow, deliberate motion, a boundary set in quiet that did not need anger or avoidance to hold. I looked out the window where the evening was beginning to settle over the city, and understood that I did not need to cut them off completely to feel free. Freedom was knowing I could choose not to step back into that cycle, even though the door was still open, and the open door itself was a reminder that my dignity belonged to me. I ran my fingertip along the warm rim of the teacup, felt the heat through the ceramic, then turned back to the table to start preparing dinner for my children. Every action I took now belonged to me. There were no more invoices attached to love, only choices built on truth, and the kind of respect I had fought to earn back for myself. The doorbell rang softly. I walked over, opened the door, and found Vanessa standing there holding a basket of fruit, her face steadier and more open than it had been a year ago when she could not look me in the eye. I took the basket and set it on the counter, picked up a knife, and peeled an apple with the slow, careful attention I gave to everything now, then handed her a slice as a welcome that did not need decoration. We sat across from each other and did not mention the numbers or the messages or the concert. We talked about small plans for the months ahead and listened to the sound of the 2 children drawing with crayons on the living room rug. I watched the way Vanessa helped Lily and Lucas pick colors and press them to paper. Her hands no longer trembling, her eyes no longer carrying the blind competitiveness that had once made her unable to see me as anything other than someone who had what she wanted. I set my teacup down and held my sister's hand for a brief moment, a forgiveness that did not require a speech, given to someone who had been brave enough to face the truth and choose a different direction. The space between us no longer held the weight of Richard and Helen. It held only the work of building something real, a family held together by honesty and action instead of flattery and debt. Family is not the people who carry the same last name. It is the people who choose to stay when things fall apart and when the storm hits. I closed the financial ledger that had run for 8 years and opened a new chapter where the love I give my children will never come with a bill attached to it. If you could go back and say one honest thing to the person who hurt you most, not to fix it, not to get an answer, but just to speak your truth out loud, what would it be? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if Myra's story made you feel a little less alone on the road back to yourself tonight, there is another story waiting for you at the link in the description below. I turned off the living room light and left only the soft glow of the hallway nightlight leading to the children's bedroom. The long walk from being someone's burden to being a free woman was over, and it ended in a quiet I had wanted for so long I had forgotten what it sounded like. I took one deep breath and felt the stillness of this house I had chosen, a stillness built from pieces of lies that had been replaced, one by one, with the truth. I hope you find the strength to protect your own.